Mark and Emily have always seemed like those rare lucky ones who manage to find true harmony in their relationships. When they got married 7 years ago, wedding guests gushed, and their friends said it was a match made in heaven. It seemed that in the whole world, there was no couple more suitable for each other. Mark, a successful architect, and Emily, a talented marketer, lived in a cozy apartment in the city center filled with warmth and laughter. Their life pulsed with a rhythm of big projects, meetings with friends, weekend trips out of town, and of course, mutual support. 7 years of marriage left their soft mark on their characters and habits. Mark learned to listen more than to talk because Emily, a wife full of ideas and emotions, loved to share her thoughts and impressions about everything in the world. She noticed subtle details, whether it was a new coffee shop on the way to work or the unique design of a building they passed every day. Mark, as a professional architect, appreciated her powers of observation. He liked that he had someone next to him who was not afraid to speak up and notice the little things. From the outside world, they had an image of an ideal couple, and their friends talked about this without a hint of irony. Many looked at them with slight envy and dreamed of the same harmony. However, recently something has begun to change. Mark began to notice that Emily was acting unusually distant. At first, he thought it was because of a new project she was running at her marketing company. Emily sometimes stayed late in the office, but this did not seem critical. Things became much more alarming when she literally began not letting go of her smartphone. Mark tried to remember when exactly he had first noticed it, perhaps on a Sunday at breakfast together, when his wife, usually happily opening the newspaper or chatting about what they should buy at the grocery store, sat across from him, biting her lip, typing something furiously on the screen. Previously, she could forget her phone at home or in another room and not worry about it, but now, it seems, she did not part with it even while showering. Mark was not a jealous person. He always believed in honesty and openness in their relationship. For 7 years, they had no loud scandals, much less any painful suspicions of infidelity. He felt like he trusted Emily like he had never trusted anyone in his life. But what was happening could not help but worry. He felt the tension in his chest every time he noticed her hastily blocking the screen when she saw that Mark was nearby. Previously, on the contrary, she would happily show him funny correspondence with her friends or show him the latest news on social networks. Now she seemed to be hiding behind the thin rectangle of the device. Worst of all, Mark began to notice nervousness in her gaze. Every time he wanted to touch her phone just to move it away from the edge of the table, she reacted too sharply. "Be careful. I'll clean it myself, thank you." Mark, of course, tried not to attach too much importance to this, because any person has the right to personal space and correspondence. But these repeated gestures, the stiffness, the new habits of Emily indicated that something was going wrong. At first, he tried to explain to himself that his wife might have found a new hobby. She started following some kind of personal growth marathon or joined a discussion chat about work. But the very tone of her voice, her curt replies, and her quick change of subject whenever he mentioned how her day was going suggested that Emily didn't want to share details. She remained silent more and more often and looked as if she had 1,000 thoughts in her head that needed to be hidden. Mark decided not to invade this space unless absolutely necessary. He knew from experience that sometimes a period of closedness or emotional withdrawal can be associated with personal experiences. But this time, everything happened differently. In the evenings, they still had dinner together. True, now Emily rarely laughed at her husband's usual jokes, and after eating, she sought to retire to the office, explaining this by the need to finish reports. Mark, who had worked for the day in his architectural studio, felt tired not only physically, but also emotionally. He was worried about what he saw, but he restrained himself from asking direct questions. Sometimes he felt that all he had to do was ask, "Emily, are you okay? Is there anything I can do to help?" And she will answer that all problems are being solved, that there is simply too much stress at work. But even despite his questions, she silently nodded and said that everything was fine. One evening, Mark was sitting in the living room at his laptop, immersed in blueprints for a new apartment complex project. And then he heard Emily whispering loudly in the corridor, closing the kitchen door. The conversation was clearly tense. Her voice was trembling, and she tried to speak as quietly as possible. Mark did not hear any names or specific words, but his heart sank with alarm. They had never had anything like this. Emily rarely went into another room to hide from her husband while talking on the phone. Usually, she could talk calmly in front of him, talk about business with colleagues or a partner, if necessary. Here, there was a different intonation: guilty, excited. A few minutes later, she came out of the kitchen, looked closely at her husband, and asked if he would like anything from the grocery store, since she planned to quickly run outside for milk. Mark, noticing her dilated pupils and slightly reddened cheeks, realized that she did not want to go into explanations about who she was talking to and why she was behaving so strangely. He replied that they really needed milk, and then asked to buy more fresh vegetables for tomorrow's breakfast. Emily nodded and quickly left, still clutching the phone to her chest. This moment stuck in Mark's memory as a sign. Something is happening behind his back, about which he does not yet have the slightest idea. The next day at work, Mark had several important meetings, but even his immersion in architectural projects did not help him to be completely distracted. Thoughts about his wife's unusual behavior did not go away. Several times he tried to write her a message. "How are you? Everything is fine. I love you." But he washed it every time, for fear of seeming intrusive. Such anxieties were not a habit in their relationship. Previously, if something bothered one, they directly spoke about it to the other. However, the current situation reflected a new side of Emily that Mark had not known before. Meanwhile, Emily was really going through turbulent processes at work. Management tasked her department with expanding its client base, and now she was forced to participate in endless Zooms, plan a marketing strategy, and had almost no free time. However, it did not escape the team that Emily often looked distracted and sad, and that it was difficult for her to concentrate. Colleagues who were accustomed to her cheerfulness and creative approach now noticed that she seemed to be constantly somewhere far away in her internal dialogue. Her close office friend, Christina, even asked directly one day, what happened? You are not yourself." But Emily just smiled tiredly and said that everything was fine. She just took on too many responsibilities. Over time, the situation worsened. Mark stayed late at work for a long time because at home he was haunted by the feeling of the cold wall that Emily had erected between them. He himself believed that perhaps his wife would go through some difficult stage, and sooner or later they would sit down over a cup of tea and talk frankly. But deep down in Mark's soul, a feeling of anxiety grew more and more. He tried not to intrude with questions so as not to cause irritation, but day by day the confidence grew within him that he could no longer remain silent. About a week after that strange phone conversation, Emily decided to take a surprise little weekend trip with the girls. This, at first glance, did not seem something extraordinary because she sometimes went with her friends to relax in nature or to a neighboring city. But this time her behavior looked completely different. She did not tell any details about who exactly she was going with and where exactly she was going, although she usually shared such plans without concealment. "We just decided spontaneously," she said, turning to her suitcase. "I myself don't really know where we'll go. Maybe we'll rent a house outside the city, maybe we'll just drive around the neighborhood." Mark listened to these words with a stone in his soul. He tried to ask why his wife was being so secretive, but Emily just shrugged. "I don't want to jinx it. I'm not in the best mood, so I thought I'd take a break." When Emily left, Mark felt almost physical pain. He noticed that starting from the day of her departure, every minute dragged on endlessly. He rushed around the rooms, trying to find something to do. I picked up her favorite book from the shelf, opened it, and saw a bookmark inside where they once read together. My heart sank. His memory brought back the memory of how they started dating. They met at a public space design presentation, where Emily was presenting an advertising strategy and Mark was conducting an architectural review. They were united by a passion for beauty in a variety of manifestations, from the shape of a city square to the lines of classical literature. This interest became the foundation on which their love was built. But now it was as if a crack had penetrated the walls of their strong house. To dispel heavy thoughts, Mark invited his best friend, Fedor, to visit. They drank tea and talked about the latest news, but soon Fyodor said, "Listen, Mark, you look like you haven't slept for a week. What's going on with you?" Mark didn't want to go into details, but he did share that Emily had become very secretive, that he felt an unusual distance between them, and was afraid to ask a direct question, lest he hear an answer he didn't want to know. Fyodor looked at him sadly and shook his head. "You know, I don't want to push anything, but maybe you've just both become too busy with work. Or have you not invited her anywhere for a romantic evening for a long time? Sometimes women need more attention." Mark thought about it. Indeed, lately they had both been drowning in their worries. Maybe if he gives her a pleasant surprise, she will open up and tell her what's happening to her. The next day, Mark called the restaurant where he proposed marriage 7 years ago. They had a free table for the coming Saturday. He booked a table for two and chose a time when the room was usually quiet and he could talk calmly. And then he sent Emily a message, short but warm. "Honey, this Saturday I want to invite you to dinner at a special place. I hope you don't have plans. I miss you and want to spend the evening with you." The answer came almost an hour later. "Thank you, dear. It seems to be free. I'll arrive at 8, just in time." Mark felt relieved maybe everything would really work out. When Saturday arrived, Mark carefully prepared. He chose the shirt Emily gave him for his anniversary, ordered a bouquet of her favorite lilies. Remembering the last time they were here together, he couldn't hide his smile. However, the day turned out strange. Emily sent him several short messages saying that she was late at work. "The boss asked me to fix the presentation. I'll be a little late, but I'll try to make it by 8. In response, Mark typed, "Don't worry, the main thing is that everything ends in time. Waiting for you." Having arrived at the restaurant at the appointed time, he sat down at a table by the window, ordered himself a mineral water, and began to wait. The clock showed 20 o'clock, then 20:15, 20:30. Emily was still missing. Mark felt an alarming pulsation growing inside him. Where had she gone? Finally, around 9, she appeared at the door, disheveled and clearly upset. Approaching Mark, she immediately apologized. Traffic, I barely made it out of the office. Sorry, really." Mark leaned down to kiss her on the cheek, but noticed her strange look, as if she was not here, but somewhere else. They ordered dinner, but Emily was tense all evening. She tried to talk about the project at work, about the endless tasks, but Mark felt that this was just the tip of the iceberg. When he mentioned that he had noticed her anxiety in recent weeks, Emily replied lamely, "I'm sorry, I don't know what's wrong with me. Sometimes I have periods like this." Mark decided not to press, hoping that the dinner would smoothly develop into a more open conversation. Unfortunately, the atmosphere of the evening remained far from romantic. Emily kept glancing at her phone, and one day she even had to leave the table, citing an urgent call from a client. When she returned, Mark saw tears in the corners of her eyes. He squeezed her hand, peering into the familiar face, trying to find a thread to her inner experiences. However, she quickly pulled her hand away and said in a barely audible voice, "Sorry, I need to go to the toilet for a while." There she disappeared for another 10 minutes. Mark sat alone, feeling how all his efforts to organize the evening were turning into painful anticipation. When Emily came back, she didn't say a word about the call and looked so depressed that Mark couldn't stand it. "Emily, honey, please tell me what's going on. I can't see you so distant. I feel like you're afraid of something or hiding something. Isn't our marriage based on trust?" To which she quietly replied, "Yes, it is based. It's just not the time. I promise we'll talk, but not today." Returning from the restaurant, Mark and Emily hardly spoke. Mark's inner voice screamed that it was time to stop these half hints and half silences, but reason prevailed, suggesting that if he asked a tough question right now, he risked destroying the thin bridges between them. He hoped that his wife would soon open up and share what was gnawing at her from the inside. But this evening, everything did not go as he wanted. The next morning, when Mark woke up, he saw that Emily was no longer at home. She left a note, "I'm out on business. I'll be back for lunch. "Don't worry, everything is fine." Mark leaned back on the pillow, feeling anxiety growing in his chest. He remembered reading once about emotional secrets and how marriages sometimes create estrangements that are difficult to overcome. At the time, he believed that this happened to others, but certainly not to him and Emily. But now all the signs pointed to the fact that the ideal union had cracked, and this crack was getting bigger every day. While Mark was preparing breakfast, he caught himself thinking that completely foreign guesses appeared in his head. Mentally, he was indignant. Has she really met someone? But he quickly cast aside these suspicions because he knew how high Emily's moral standard was. However, what if something completely different happened in her life, a crisis, an internal conflict that she does not want to talk about, believing that she must cope with it herself? Or is she worried about the problems of her family, and it's hard for her to talk about it? There were too many questions, but no answers. Already in the middle of the day, Mark finally called his wife to ask how far she was and if she needed help. Emily didn't answer the phone. 10 minutes passed, and a short message came. "Mark, I'm busy. I'll call you back later." He raised his eyebrows. He used to receive calls from her so often that he didn't have time to get bored. They exchanged news, photographs, and voice messages. Now she seemed to keep him at a distance. Mark felt a growing sense of resentment. Yes, he was never an oppressive or jealous husband, but what was happening was like a signal that could not be ignored. A few hours later, Emily returned home. She was quiet, her eyes downcast. Mark suggested drinking tea, and they sat down at the kitchen table. While the water in the kettle was heating up, he looked at her intently and said, "Honey, understand, I don't want to put pressure on you, but you must understand how I feel. Every breath you take and every strange look tells you that a storm is brewing inside you. I am your husband. I am ready to listen, ready to understand. Please don't be silent. Say something. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." Emily looked at her cup for a long time, as if searching for answers in it. Finally, she said, barely audible, "Forgive me. I don't know how to explain everything. It's something I have to figure out myself, but I'm afraid I'll make it worse." Worse for whom? Mark couldn't stand it. Emily just shrugged and stared out the window. Endless silence was like torture for him. From that day on, the situation became almost routine. Emily kept the phone nearby, went off to talk alone, slept poorly, and looked constantly tired. Mark, in turn, suffered from his helplessness. He tried to come up with 100 explanations. Perhaps we are talking about the serious illness of one of her parents. But then she usually shared her experiences because they always had an agreement. Together they are stronger than apart. Or maybe she has a conflict at work and is afraid that Mark will force her to quit. He recalled that he once advised her to change jobs if there was no opportunity for growth. But then she just laughed. "I love my profession. It's just that sometimes the boss goes too far." In desperation, Mark even thought about checking her phone, but immediately pushed the thought away. It would be a betrayal of their mutual trust. He decided that if she couldn't or wouldn't talk, there must be some meaning. Perhaps she just needs time. But time passed, and no clarity was added. The ideal image of their marriage, which previously seemed so strong and reliable, gradually began to collapse in Mark's mind. He felt that understatement was having a detrimental effect on his own condition. It was becoming increasingly difficult to concentrate on projects, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to smile at colleagues and even friends. One evening, when Emily received a call again and went out onto the balcony, Mark could not restrain himself and crept up to the slightly open door. He didn't hear the words, but there was such pain in his wife's voice that his heart sank. Then she said brokenly, "I don't know how to say this. I just can't." And noticing that he was standing at the door, she quickly turned around, covering the receiver with her hand. "Mark, what are you eavesdropping on?" she hissed. He became embarrassed and retreated, feeling a wave of shame wash over him. But it was too late. It was as if a sparkling wire of mistrust was rushing between them, breaking in a short circuit. Anger and regret mixed inside Mark, and Emily quickly ended the conversation and disappeared into the bathroom. The next day, Mark sat down in his studio and began drawing a sketch of a new private house that a longtime client had ordered for him. He tried to create a space filled with light, lightness, and harmony. But at some point, I noticed that my hand was shaking, and my thoughts were returning to the night incident on the balcony. The pain of realizing that Emily was deliberately hiding something important from him was too great for creative inspiration to take over. He put down his pencil, sighed, and stared out the office window. Several more days passed in a similar vein. The relationship in the house resembled an unsteady truce. They talked about everyday trifles, what to buy, where to go, how to spend the weekend, but did not touch on the deep topic that was simmering between them. Sometimes it seemed to Mark that Emily was struggling herself, trying to find a way to admit something. He was ready to hear everything, even the worst, just to put an end to this uncertainty. However, the decisive conversation never came. Despite the nervous tension, their common life continued to flow. Mark was preparing for an architectural exhibition where he invited potential investors. Emily went to the office in the morning and returned more and more tired and immersed in her experiences. She began to skip dinners with friends, citing overwork. Friends wrote to Mark, asking what happened, why Emily stopped showing up. He made excuses that she was going through a difficult period and had a lot of work. But in my heart, I understood. Her behavior could no longer be explained by stress alone. Mark soon found himself thinking that he was afraid to go into their bedroom when Emily was there, because every minute they shared became either a cold formality or an awkward silence. She did not seek to quarrel, but clearly avoided serious conversation. The neighbor's cat, who sometimes visited them out of habit, seemed friendlier than Emily. This understanding made Mark languish with melancholy. He recalled how a year ago they traveled to Italy and walked hand in hand along the streets of Rome, discussing architectural masterpieces. Then it seemed to them that their love was eternal and nothing could destroy it. But the reality now was completely different. At work, walking past the mirrored corridor, Mark saw his reflection. His features became sharper, his eyes looked tired. He felt that he was no longer sure of anything. In special moments, when his mind was cold and his heart seemed to be twisted with disappointment, the thought came to him, maybe she has found someone else, and I just don't want to admit it. But then an inner voice answered, it's too early to draw such conclusions without direct evidence. Moreover, you know Emily, deception has always been unacceptable to her. However, the shadow of doubt grew. One evening, when they bumped into each other in the kitchen, Emily suddenly stopped at the table and said in a quiet voice, Mark, I know you feel betrayed, confused, but believe me, I don't want to hurt you. I just need to deal with one problem. There was such sadness in her eyes that Mark felt compassion awakening inside him. He took a step towards her, carefully took her hand and said, no matter what happens, I'm there. I won't leave, I won't turn away. Tell me, and we will get through this together. But Emily just squeezed his hand and barely whispered, I'm sorry, and ran out into the bedroom, leaving Mark completely bewildered. It was the last thing he could bear. Mark realized that he could no longer pretend that nothing was happening. He realized that silence was becoming an unbearable burden for both of them, corroding their trust. The next day, when he walked into the apartment after another hard day at work, he found Emily sitting on the sofa, staring at the floor as if waiting for him. Her clothes were sloppy, her hair was carelessly tied up, her eyes were swollen from crying. Mark felt his heart sink into his heels. He didn't know what she would say, but he was ready for anything to hear the truth. Emily's fragile voice cut through the silence of the room. We need to talk. Mark sat down next to him, trying to remain calm, although everything inside was burning with nervous tension. He understood, this is it, the moment of truth. Perhaps now she will tell you that she fell in love with someone else. Or she will say that she has serious problems that she was afraid to talk about. In any case, it is impossible to hide it any longer. And at that second he peered into her eyes, and it seemed to him that he saw there the reflection of a sick conscience and fear. Fear of losing what they had, fear of admitting that it could ruin everything. Emily took a deep breath and closed her eyes. She seemed to be mentally preparing to jump into the abyss. Mark, realizing that his life could radically change in the coming minutes, felt that his own pulse was going off scale. He opened his mouth to say something soothing, but she beat him to it, whispering, "Mark, I." And at that moment her phone rang again. She fell silent in fear, grabbed it from her pocket, looked at the screen, and tensed up, as if she had seen something terrible. Mark watched this, unable to control his growing anxiety. She stood up and walked a couple of steps away, turning away from Mark. "Hello? Yes, I can't talk. Yes, I understand. Okay, I'll contact you later." There were broken notes in her voice, and her hand was noticeably trembling. Mark realized that everything was heading towards the same scenario. Recognition was delayed, and tension continued to rise. As soon as she hung up, he asked with almost desperation in his voice, "Who was it?" "Emily, please, no more secrets. You said you wanted to talk." She took another shaky breath, and tears welled up in her eyes. She whispered, "just give me a little more time. I'm asking you." Mark sat in the dimly lit living room, his elbows on his knees and his hands clasping his temples. He listened to the sounds of the evening city outside the window, but suddenly realized that time seemed to have slowed down. Over the past few weeks, a tense silence had reigned between him and Emily, and all attempts to find out what was happening only ran into his wife's isolation and desperate tearfulness. But now something has changed. He saw it in her eyes when she entered the apartment and silently sat down opposite him on the sofa. "Mark," she said quietly, "we need to talk." He slowly raised his head and met her reddened eyes. Emily sat in front of him, the girl with whom he had once shared all the joys and sorrows, with whom he was sure that he would spend his life. But in recent weeks, it has become clear that their relationship will never be the same. And yet he could not completely believe that there could be betrayal in their ideal marriage. "I'm listening," Mark said, and his voice was firmer than he expected. Emily sighed, nervously tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and, looking away, began to speak haltingly. "I know you've been feeling this for a long time. That something is wrong with me. I'm sorry I didn't tell you earlier that I was delaying. I was scared. I know this will sound terrible, but I have to confess." Mark felt his heart clench painfully in his chest. The mere thought that she must confess made him feel as if he was cold. The voice trembled. "Confess what, Emily?" She looked at him with eyes full of tears and squeezed out, "I cheated on you," and, as if she herself didn't believe the words spoken, she covered her mouth with her hand. "It happened once. I don't know how it happened. I I was at a corporate party. I drank too much." A deep silence fell over the room. Mark felt as if he had lost the ability to breathe. He slowly stood up, took a couple of steps to the window, and stared out at the flickering lights of the street. Thoughts were racing at breakneck speed. She cheated. With who? When? Why? It was like a punch in the gut. He always believed that their trust was inviolable, that something like this was simply impossible in their family. But here it is, reality. Emily admits that she was with another man. With whom? He finally asked without turning around. "With Trevor. Trevor from my department. You don't know him. He recently came to us." Emily pronounced the words with difficulty. "It happened once, I swear. I was terribly drunk then. It didn't even happen again. After everything, I realized that I had made a terrible mistake." Mark sank heavily back into the chair and covered his face with his hands. Trevor is some kind of alien name, sounding in his home, in his world. A young colleague, charismatic, able to light up a crowd. He imagined how they could dance at a party, how this man hugs his wife, how she is in a fit of intoxication. From these images, everything inside was boiling. "When was this?" he asked after a long pause. "2 months ago. There was a corporate party on the roof of a business center. I already said that I drank too much, and Trevor. He refilled my cocktails. When everyone began to leave, he offered to give me a ride home. We went into the office to pick up my bag. And it happened there. I myself don't understand how I let it happen." Mark was silent. Her every answer was like a sharp splinter piercing his heart. The heart did not want to admit that this was reality and not a nightmare. He didn't look at her, but he heard her breathing convulsively and saw her occasionally wiping tears from her face with the sleeve of her sweater. And after that, what? Mark asked, trying to pull himself together. Did you continue to communicate? Are you having an affair? No, no. Emily raised her eyes full of despair to him. There was no romance. Immediately after I came to my senses, I realized that it was all a mistake. I told him that we should forget about what happened. But I felt guilt, shame. I didn't know how to look into your eyes. Trevor seemed to take this as some kind of adventure. He began to write to me, flirt with me, and hint that he liked me. I blocked his number and asked him to stay away from me. After that, a nightmare began. He wrote from different numbers, blackmailing me with messages that he would tell my boss or you about everything. I I was afraid that you would not find out about everything from me. Mark understood that he should remain calm, but a hurricane of conflicting feelings grew inside him: anger, resentment, disappointment, pain. He asked quietly, "So, because of this, you haven't found a place for yourself in recent weeks? Did you hide your phone and go into another room to talk?" "Yes," Emily nodded. "I was afraid that he would write or call. I myself didn't know how to explain everything. I wasn't going to get sucked into this crazy whirlpool. But as soon as he started writing again, I had to react somehow, to persuade him to leave me alone. I thought that if I kept silent, everything would work out, but it only got worse. But I couldn't confess to you because I couldn't bring myself to tell you this monstrous truth. I love you, Mark. You are the best person in my life. I was in such despair. All these nights I did not sleep because I realized that I had betrayed you. But I didn't want to lose you." Emily buried her face in her hands and burst into tears. Her shoulders shook slightly. Mark sat opposite, amazed by the scope of the picture that opened to him. On the one hand, he felt deceived. He didn't know if he would ever be able to forgive the betrayal. On the other hand, he saw Emily suffering and understood. She made a mistake, not intentionally, but under the influence of alcohol and perhaps her inner vulnerability. "Are you sure it was really a one-time accident?" he asked in a calmer tone, although bitterness remained in his voice. "Yes," she breathed. "I swear, I regret this more than anything in the world. If I could turn back time, I would never have gone to this party. I'm sorry, Mark, I beg you." The last words came out barely audible through a muffled sob. Mark stood up and walked to the window, trying to collect his thoughts. Thousands of lights lit up during the night, and he felt himself in the center of a black, bottomless void. "I'm sorry," he repeated bitterly, almost turning to himself. "For what? For breaking our trust. Emily, you know this is the most important thing for me. I could understand everything: fatigue, stress, even some kind of flirting, but not physical betrayal." "I understand," she whispered. "You can't imagine how much I reproach myself for what happened. I haven't been able to eat or sleep normally for a week, a month. Every day I went to work as if I were going to hard labor. I was afraid to meet him, to hear his jokes. He, he thinks I should relax and have fun since I already agreed once. But I don't know. I just want everything to go back, so that we can go back to that moment where everything was still good." She began to sob again, and Mark felt that two forces were fighting in his soul. The first is anger, the desire to push her away, to punish her for her lies and betrayal. The second is love, memories of the days when they were inseparable, of the warmth of her smile, of how much they experienced together during 7 years of marriage. "Why didn't you tell me right away?" he asked after a long pause. "We could decide together what to do about it." I I was too afraid to lose you," she whispered, sobbing, "and I thought that if I told her, it would only speed up the end. Sorry, I was wrong." Mark was silent for a long time, gripping the edge of the window sill until his knuckles turned white. Then he asked a question that I couldn't help but ask. "Do you love him? At least a little?" He heard some kind of painful trembling in his own voice. Emily immediately pulled back. "No," she exclaimed, almost in despair. "It's not about love, it was just. I was passed out, I didn't understand what I was doing. I don't need him. Lord, Mark, I love only you." "Then why?" Mark began, but stopped short. He knew there was no good answer to this question. Alcohol, the party atmosphere, a woman confused in her feelings. All this is banal and as ridiculous as any story about betrayal. He turned away from the window and looked at Emily. She sat on the sofa, hugging herself with her arms and looking at him with tear-filled eyes. She did not try to make excuses, did not accuse him of lack of attention. She simply looked with an unhappy look, showing that she was aware of her fall and her guilt. "So this Trevor guy was following you, blackmailed?" he asked, trying to determine how deep the problem was. "Yes," she nodded. "He apparently decided that I was just breaking down and also threatened to tell me about our affair in the company. I'm afraid that if my boss finds out then, it could ruin my career. I understood that this would destroy our marriage too, so I tried to hush it up until the last moment. But it only got worse. Sorry." "And you were afraid that I wouldn't understand?" Mark asked, running his hand through his hair. Although, to be honest, if I had learned about this from Trevor's words or from some rumors, it would have been even more painful. "I know," she whispered. "I'm confused, Mark. This is what they jokingly talk about. A moment of weakness. But in reality, it crossed out everything. I don't ask you to forget all this like a bad dream. I understand that it doesn't happen that way. But I beg you, give me a chance to make things right. I'm ready to do whatever you say. Quit, change jobs, move to another city, just to be with you. I love you." She reached for his hand, but he involuntarily pulled away. "The wound is too fresh. The pain is too intense. You can't just take it and forgive it right away," he said, feeling his voice begin to tremble. "I need time to understand what to do next. Forgive, or please don't push me away," she sobbed. "Yes, it's my fault. I acted meanly, but I don't want to lose you." Mark walked around the room, trying to breathe more evenly. Past happy moments surfaced in his memory. Their wedding, honeymoon, traveling together, gifts, sudden romantic dinners. And now everything is in the balance because of one act. But one betrayal can destroy many years of trust, which they sought with such love. "You know," he finally said, "the worst thing for me now is the feeling that I don't know how to live on. Would I want to live with you, together under the same roof, when every memory of us will be mixed with the fact that you spent that night with? This Trevor, Mark, I don't want to blame you or shout at you now," he said quietly. "It's just that everything inside me seems to be scorched. You say it's a mistake, but that doesn't make it any easier. We built a marriage on fidelity, and I loved you like no one else in the world." His voice broke at the last sentence. Emily curled up on the couch and cried even harder. She had nothing to say except, "I'm sorry." And she repeated it over and over again, almost in a whisper, like a mantra, hoping that one word would erase all the pain that ran through their lives. But Mark knew that sorry was only the beginning of a long and difficult journey. At least half an hour passed before there was relative calm. Emily covered her face with her palms and froze, and Mark still stood at the window, feeling as if a draft had passed through his heart. He didn't show it outwardly, but inside there was a whole whirlpool of emotions. The desire to forgive after all, he loved her, and anger, and a feeling of humiliation. Finally, he approached her, sat down next to her on the sofa, and quietly asked, "What are you going to do? I mean, with work, with this Trevor?" Emily wiped away her tears and tried to speak more confidently. "I've already thought about quitting. It's still hard for me to be in a place where everything reminds me of that evening. I found several vacancies in other companies, although they are not as attractive. But I don't care. The main thing is that I'm ready to change everything so that we can try to restore the relationship." Mark nodded. He understood that her dismissal would not correct what had already happened, but at least it would remove from their lives the threat of the constant presence of the person with whom the betrayal happened. In his heart, he didn't want to punish her with substandard work, just to make her suffer. He was not the type to take revenge. But inside, he heard an inner voice. Since she's ready to quit, she'd better get away from this Trevor, away from the memories. "About us," he said slowly, "Emily, I can't say now that I forgive everything, and tomorrow everything will be the same. It takes time. I need to get over this. Perhaps I will ask you to live with your parents or a friend for a while to sort yourself out." With these words, Emily took another shaky breath, her eyes filled with tears. "I understand, but know that I will not give up on us. I will fight. I will prove to you that I am ready to atone for my guilt." Mark nodded slowly. He felt how the pain from betrayal and pity for the woman crying next to him mixed into something difficult to describe. He wanted to hold her, wanted to caress her, and tell her that they would find a way to get through this, but part of him fiercely resisted any gestures of reconciliation. He couldn't overcome his despair so quickly. "I need time," he repeated, "and it might be better for us not to tell anyone about this until we ourselves decide what to do. I don't want friends or family to interfere until we figure this out." "Of course," she agreed. "I didn't tell anyone. And Trevor, I think, will also not spread too much if I stay away." She paused, thought, and added, "Although he threatened me that he would tell me. But if I quit, I hope he will leave me alone." There was a painful pause for some time. The evening seemed to become even darker, and only the yellowish light of the table lamp picked out their pale, exhausted faces from the twilight. "I'll spend the night in the guest room tonight," Mark finally said, getting up. "Don't be offended. I just need to be alone." "Okay," Emily answered quietly. "I understand everything. I'm glad at least that now you know the truth. I hope we can still be together. Sorry, Mark." Her whisper hung in the air, and Mark left the room, feeling that a hole the size of his old life had formed inside. He quietly closed the door to the guest room behind him, sat down on the couch, and closed his eyes. Moments of their past happiness played before him, like stills from a film, then her tears, her confession, and the name of a man whom he did not know, but who for one evening became closer to Emily than her own husband. A month has passed since Emily admitted her cheating. The words that she said then still rang in Mark's ears. "It was a mistake. I was drunk. I don't love him. I love you." He had already tried more than once to mentally sort the situation into pieces and understand what to do. His first reaction was to leave, slam the door, and never come back. But he could not bring himself to take this decisive step. Their 7 years of married life, their common past, plans for the future, all this did not let him go. He decided to stay and try to overcome the pain, despite the bitter realization that the trust between them had cracked. Nevertheless, life in their apartment now seemed stretched to the limit. They talked to each other, but only about everyday matters. Both tried not to mention the event itself, but unspoken feelings hung in the air, as if filling the rooms with invisible electricity. When Emily tried to approach him, hug him, put her head on his shoulder, Mark involuntarily tensed, and then took a step to the side as if the very fact of the touch burned him. He could not forget that someone else had touched his wife, and these images haunted him day and night. They didn't have sex. Since the truth came out, Mark has not found the strength to lie next to his wife in the same bed and feel the same tenderness that used to be a natural part of their lives. At night, he looked at the ceiling and wondered whether a person was able to erase the fact of betrayal from his memory. Deep down, he still loved Emily after all. Feelings do not disappear overnight. But as soon as she tried to touch him, terrible images appeared before his eyes. Someone else's hands on her body, someone else's lips. This made him shrink into a ball and, sighing heavily, turn to the wall. Emily, feeling his withdrawal, cried quietly into her pillow. So night after night passed. After the confession, Emily felt a terrible relief because she no longer kept this painful secret. But she soon realized that recognition was only the beginning of the journey. She decided to quit her job, leave the company where Trevor worked. Management was surprised by her resignation after all. She was one of the promising marketers in the department. They tried to persuade her to stay, but Emily firmly said that, for personal reasons, she was forced to leave her position. She did not reveal the details. She simply packed her things, wrote a statement, and waved to her colleagues, trying not to reveal her inner feelings. She admitted to her closest friend, Christina, that there were difficulties in the family, and she needed a change of scenery. She expressed support, although she was shocked by such drastic measures. "Emily, you loved your job. I'm sure the problem is not just with the new employee, right? But Emily just shrugged her shoulders silently. It was unbearable for her to remember the evening at the corporate party and her own stupidity, which cost her her husband's love. She thought that by leaving the company, at least she would get rid of the fear of meeting Trevor there. Now she wanted only one thing: to regain Mark's favor at any cost, to prove to him that he was more important to her than anything in the world. Emily tried to act kindly and caringly. She prepared Mark's favorite dishes, asked questions about his work, asked if he wanted to look at old photographs together or a movie that they both once adored. But every attempt at rapprochement was broken by a cold, "I'm tired," or "let's do it another time." Mark didn't yell at her or openly reproach her, but he didn't want to get closer either. Gradually, he began to stay late at his architectural firm under the pretext that he had a lot of projects and responsibilities. Colleagues in the office noticed that he looked broken. His eyes were red-veined, his face was drawn. However, outwardly Mark tried to hold on. He communicated with customers, drew drawings, and met with investors. No one had any idea that a storm was raging inside him, except, perhaps, his best friend Fedor. He carefully started the conversation a couple of times. "Listen, Mark, what's going on? You're somehow not yourself, but we haven't seen each other for 100 years." Mark just threw up his hands and said, "Yes, just a lot of work and lack of sleep." When Mark finally got ready to go home, he felt that he was not ready to face Emily again and her pleading smile in her eyes. He was afraid of the repeating scene. She tries to speak, offers tea, and he sighs and goes into the bedroom or even retires to the guest room. The very thought of home caused a nervous shiver to rise within. That's when he began to notice on his way home a small, almost inconspicuous bar on one of the side streets. Behind the dusty storefront, a soft light glowed, and a wooden sign, faded with time, read "Old Oak." One day, instead of turning towards the house, Mark walked up to the heavy oak door, hesitantly opened a crack, and went inside. The bar turned out to be cozy and quiet. Unlike modern establishments with loud music and a dance floor, there was an almost homely atmosphere here. Soft light from lamps, several tables with lamps, neatly arranged bottles behind the counter. Soft blues music was playing, which seemed to penetrate straight into the soul. There were only a couple of people there that evening, and there was a waitress behind the bar, who apparently was also helping out as a bartender. She appeared to be in her mid-30s, with brown hair pulled back into a loose bun. When Mark entered, she smiled at him with a simple, not feigned smile. "Good evening. Have a seat. What will you order?" Mark looked at her, feeling that for the first time in a long time someone was greeting him with a calm, friendly gaze. There was no ostentatious politeness in this, just ordinary human warmth. He sat down at the counter and said, "Let's whiskey with ice. Or no, something lighter is better. Maybe a glass of ale?" "Of course," she answered without asking any further questions. As she poured the drink, Mark noted that her face showed weariness. But at the same time, she seemed to be trying to remain cheerful. When she placed the glass in front of him, he quietly said, "Thank you," and took a small sip. The ale was pleasantly bitter and slightly cool. Mark, feeling the internal tension receding a little, asked an innocent question. "How long have you been working here? I hadn't noticed this bar before." She grinned. "I also didn't notice it before until I found myself unemployed and decided that temporary work as a bartender or waitress was better than sitting idle. My name is Sarah." "I'm Mark," he answered. "Nice to meet you. How do you like it here?" Sarah shrugged. "The place is not bad, quiet, mostly regular customers. I love peace. What about you? Judging by the look, you now also want to take your mind off something." Mark froze for a moment. He himself did not fully understand what exactly he was looking for in this bar. Maybe he just wanted privacy and a glass of strong drink, or maybe he subconsciously needed someone's kind word. "Probably yes," he admitted in a low voice. "It's not easy for me now." Sarah nodded, as if she understood more than he thought, and she didn't ask what exactly happened to him. Instead, she asked, "Do you want to listen to music? I can turn on a record or radio. We have a small vinyl collection here. Let's do something jazzy, Mark suggested. Sarah smiled and disappeared behind the counter to find the record. A minute later, the soft sounds of a saxophone began to sound in the room, and Mark felt the lonely bitterness in his soul gradually recede. He told Sarah that he works as an architect and that he has a heavy workload now. Sarah briefly said that she had previously worked in the tourism industry, but due to the crisis she lost her job, and now she is getting by with temporary work. She would like to return to the big job, but for now she is happy with at least stable tips and a free schedule. By closing time, by the time the bar began to close, Mark already felt a little calmer. Sarah wished him good luck, and he went out into the night street, trying not to think about what awaited him at home. Emily will probably once again quietly watch him undress, perhaps try to talk about something, and he will remain silent. A week passed, and Mark began to come to Old Oak more and more often. Sometimes he would just grab a mocktail and leave after 15 minutes. Other evenings he stayed longer, sat down at the counter, and Sarah nodded her head to greet him as if he were an acquaintance. Sometimes she even came out from behind the counter to exchange a few words with him, if there was almost no one in the room. Mark was surprised to find that these short conversations about trifles, about the weather, about music, about Sarah's new works that she was looking for brought him an unusual feeling of lightness. She didn't try to court him, didn't make ambiguous hints, and didn't act like a psychologist asking tough questions. Just letting him take his mind off home and Emily for a little while. Sometimes Mark thought, am I doing the right thing? After all, I'm actually running away from my own wife to someone else's woman, even if we're just talking. But he reassured himself that their conversations were innocent and there was no betrayal in them. And yet, every time he returned home, he experienced mixed feelings. On the one hand, his soul felt a little lighter. On the other hand, he understood that he was sinking deeper into an emotional distance from Emily. One evening, when he arrived almost midnight, Emily was waiting for him in the living room. Her eyes were red, as if she had been crying. "Where have you been?" she asked, trying to speak in a calm tone. "I worry when you come back so late." "At work," Mark lied, and then, without meaning to, he added, "and he went into the bar. I needed to unwind a little." Emily frowned. "To the bar? With whom?" "One," Mark said, and an irritated tone was already in his voice. "But even if not alone, you have no right to interrogate me. Isn't that right?" Emily looked down. "No, I didn't want interrogation, I feel like you're doing everything just not to see me. You come home when I'm all ready." "How do you imagine?" He flared up. "Should I stand on the threshold, rejoice, hug you, and pretend that everything is okay? No, Emily, I can't. I'm trying to cope as best I can. I don't want to scream and make trouble, but you can see for yourself that I still can't get over the betrayal." He himself did not expect to utter the word betrayal out loud. It hung in the air like a sentence. Emily frowned, tears welling up in her eyes. "Forgive me," she said quietly. "I'm not going to make excuses. I just wanted to say that. I'm afraid of losing you completely. You leave in the morning, come back late. I understand that the reason for this was my terrible mistake, but I ask you, try to talk to me. At least sometimes. Let's go out together, have dinner in the city like before." Mark dropped his shoulders and swallowed the lump in his throat. He understood that she was trying, and yet anger flared up periodically inside him. Why is she asking me to behave normally if she herself has destroyed this normality? "Sorry, I'm not ready," he said dryly. "Maybe later." And passing by her, he headed to the guest room, where, in fact, he had been sleeping for many days. Behind him, he heard her muffled sobbing, but did not stop. He didn't want to talk anymore now. He was too exhausted from the internal struggle. Another Friday evening has arrived. Mark finished work a little earlier than usual, but didn't want to rush home. He stood on the street, wondering where to go, and his feet led him to Old Oak. It was calm and semi-dark inside. An elderly couple was sitting at one of the tables, and Sarah, as always, was behind the counter. Seeing Mark, she smiled, although a little sadly. "Hello? Ale again?" "Hello," he replied, sitting down on a high stool. "Yes, you can have ale. How are you doing?" Sarah sighed. "Honestly, not in the best way. Yesterday I got a call from the agency. There is practically no work in tourism. We'll have to wait a little longer. And there are few people here, there are almost no tips." "I'm sorry," Mark said sincerely, taking the mug from her hands. "I was hoping you'd already made some progress." She shrugged her shoulders and looked thoughtful. "No, don't worry. I have already gotten used to these black streaks of life. I hope everything will work out soon." Mark took a sip, feeling a pleasant bitterness on his tongue. Then, almost unexpectedly, even for himself, he said, "You know, Sarah, I'm not having the best streak in my life either. There are serious problems with my wife. For a month now, I can't stop thinking about one thing she did, and at the same time, I don't want to destroy the family." Sarah looked at him with understanding sympathy, but did not ask for details. A month has passed since the evening when Emily confessed to Mark that she had cheated on her. It seemed like they stayed together, but there was a gap of mistrust between them. Mark tried to remain restrained, pretending that everything was getting better, but in reality he could not bring himself to forget how another man touched his wife. Every touch from Emily reminded him of those images in his head that he couldn't erase. Therefore, he returned home later than usual, remained alone with her in the same room less and less, and preferred to spend the evening somewhere outside. Usually after work, he went to the bar to unwind. As it turned out, this helped. You could drink a couple of cocktails or just sit at the counter. There he met Sarah, then she worked as a waitress. Friendly, quiet, without unnecessary questions. Mark quickly got used to her smile and rare phrases. She never imposed herself, but knew how to create a calm atmosphere around herself, in which the torment of jealousy for Emily and the pain of betrayal receded for a while. However, recently Sarah suddenly disappeared. One evening another girl, obviously new, took her place. Mark, feeling uneasy, asked the bartender if Sarah had gone on vacation. He replied that she was forced to quit. She said something about problems with the owner of the apartment and debts, and they paid her pennies here. Mark didn't see Sarah for a couple of days, until one day he ran into her literally on the threshold of the bar. She was coming in to pick up some last-minute things. She looked tired and upset. "Hello," she said quietly. "Hello, Sarah. Where have you gone?" Sarah sighed, lowering her eyes. "I was fired, or rather, they presented me with a fact. Staff reduction. The new owners of the bar were not satisfied with my conditions. And I have enough problems myself. I owe rent on the house, but I couldn't find a new job so quickly." "Sorry for asking," Mark said sincerely. "Maybe I can help with something." She smiled automatically, but there was a hint of despair in her eyes. "Thank you, of course, but I doubt that your company needs a former waitress." Sarah's words struck a chord with Mark. He knew that his architectural company occasionally had vacancies. For example, someone was needed at the reception to greet clients and answer calls. The work is generally not difficult, but requires accuracy and politeness. Sarah was friendly. She knew how to get along with people, why not? He carefully suggested. "You see, we just had some space in our office. We need a person who would meet visitors at the reception and help with documents. I think I could recommend you." Sarah frowned in surprise. "Are you serious?" "Mark, I don't have experience in office work. I'm afraid I won't be able to handle it." "It doesn't require deep knowledge of architecture," he reassured her. "It is important to be friendly, carefully maintain a database of calls and record meetings. You already worked with clients in a bar, but this is a different area. If you want, let's try it." Sarah hesitated and then nodded as if clutching at a straw. "I would be very grateful. There is no longer enough money even for the next payment for the apartment." Mark smiled briefly. "Then go ahead. I will forward your details to the head of the Customer Relations Department." 2 weeks later, Sarah was already settled in at the architectural company, sitting at the reception desk, taking calls, scheduling meetings. Seeing her in business attire instead of her usual jeans and t-shirt Mark felt involuntarily proud that he had helped her get out of the quagmire. Sarah quickly got used to it and carried out instructions without any questions. The management turned out to be pleased the team valued calmness, and she was just tactful and friendly. When Mark casually stopped by her table, they exchanged a few words. At some point, he noticed that Sarah was smiling again with the same warmth as she had once in the bar, and an unusual feeling arose inside him. He wanted to stay longer, ask how she was doing, even if this went beyond the scope of formal businesslike behavior. Sarah also felt her sympathy for Mark growing. He seemed to her a noble, sensitive man, even if withdrawn and wounded from the inside. She didn't ask why he avoided talking about his wife, why he was wary. She only guessed that not everything was all right in his family. Mark's work days went on as usual. Meetings, sketches of projects, discussions with clients. But now he increasingly found himself looking forward to those brief moments when he could walk up to the reception desk and say hello to Sarah. It wasn't that he was specifically looking for excuses, but he was drawn to this unobtrusive, friendly girl, next to whom he didn't have to suffer from nightmares about betrayal. One day, towards the end of the working day, when the employees began to leave, Mark lingered in the office, completing urgent edits to the drawings. Suddenly, Sarah appeared at the entrance. "Sorry for interrupting," she said embarrassedly, entering the office. "I just wanted to say that according to the schedule, I have to close the reception today. Check the documentation. Here. And one more thing, I wanted to thank you." "For what?" Mark asked, looking up from the monitor. Sarah came closer, looking down. "For saving me from debt. If it weren't for this job, I would have lost my apartment a long time ago. And," she smiled confusedly, "I've already managed to earn some extra money at a bar, but there are also meetings and drinking guests. But here I feel stability. This is very important to me." Mark felt warmth spreading through his chest, hearing her gratitude. He was about to say something like, "Don't," when suddenly she leaned towards him and quietly whispered, "I feel so good next to you, Mark." The next second, her lips touched his. The kiss was soft, timid, but stunning. Mark seemed numb for a few moments. A fire of desire flared up in him, which he had not experienced in a relationship with Emily for a long time. The same fire immediately gave rise to anxiety and fear. Is it possible? I'm still Emily's husband, despite all the pain. Sarah felt that he was not answering and pulled back, embarrassed to the point of tears. "I'm sorry," she breathed, pressing her hands to her chest. "I don't know what came over me. Probably shouldn't have." Mark was breathing heavily, a whirlwind of feelings raging in his head. He felt that he wanted her for the first time with a strange woman he had no disgust or moral block. "But then I remembered how I myself experienced the betrayal of my wife." Clenching his fists, he said quietly, "You are very dear to me, Sarah, but I can't." "You have a wife," she nodded bitterly. "Sorry. I'm not going to judge you," Mark whispered, rising from the table. "It's just, I'm now in a situation where every mistake can destroy everything. I already, I don't know what to do. I..." He hesitated, not finding the right words to explain how painful this struggle was for him. To remain faithful to a marriage in which so much pain had accumulated, or to succumb to a new, alluring sympathy. Sarah closed her eyes, brushing away a tear. "Understand, and yet, forgive me, please. I won't do that again. It's just that sometimes it seems to me that there is something between us. But if it hurts you, then I'll stop." Mark hesitated for a few seconds, then nodded hesitantly. "It's better to pretend that this didn't happen. I really like you, but my story with my wife is too complicated." "I can't," he repeated, as if convincing himself. Sarah remained silent, only sadly looking away. Then she quietly turned around, walked out the door, and left him alone with a heavy heart. When Mark returned home, Emily noticed that he was more self-absorbed than usual. She asked, "Are you late again? Did something happen?" "No," he answered briefly, trying to hide the trembling in his voice. In fact, a real storm was breaking in his soul. He couldn't get Sarah's soft lips, her eyes full of understanding and feeling out of his head. What if she is the one with whom he can feel happy again? Or maybe this is just a momentary outbreak that needs to be smothered so as not to deepen the wounds. Emily clearly sensed his inner confusion, but did not dare ask any more questions. After all, their relationship was already hanging by a thread. She remained silent, not suspecting that that very evening Mark had almost repeated the very sin that had once destroyed his own peace. Ever since that evening when Sarah unexpectedly kissed him in the office, Mark's soul had been in chaos. He kept telling himself that he wanted to be true to his principles and would not betray Emily. However, his heart stubbornly made its choice. He could not forget Sarah. Every glance of hers, every chance meeting in the corridor of the company caused him excitement. He saw that she was trying to keep her distance, but when their eyes crossed, they could see mutual attraction. At home, everything remained tense as before. Emily, although she tried to be more attentive and caring, seemed to have lost that loving radiance that had once won his heart. And most importantly, even after all his attempts to just forget about her betrayal, obsessive images continued to pop up in Mark's head, which made him feel uneasy. He thought, I sincerely wanted to save the family, but how can I live if everything inside me rebels against touching my wife who was with someone else? At some point, Mark realized he was falling in love with Sarah, and at the same time he feels a sense of betrayal towards Emily, although it was she who betrayed his trust in the first place. It increasingly seemed to him that he could no longer be close to his wife, but was drawn to another woman with whom he had not been connected for years of marriage, but with whom he was beginning to feel much closer emotionally. However, memories of his own pain did not allow him to simply throw into the pool of a new relationship. He was afraid to repeat Emily's scenario, having learned firsthand how painful it was to learn about someone else's betrayal. And even though he no longer felt the former passion for his wife, he was not going to deceive her or hide his second affair. Mark said to himself, if I decide to be with Sarah, it will only be after I put an end to my current marriage. I don't want to play behind my back. Emily herself felt that Mark was moving further away. She saw how he can be absent-minded, come home untimely, and now a woman has appeared in the company, whom he once accommodated just out of kindness. Although Mark did not tell what happened between them, women's intuition whispered to Emily that things were headed for disaster. She literally followed him around the house, trying to establish at least some contact. Mark, let's have dinner together. Let's invite friends. Let's take a break, she suggested one morning. He shook his head. I don't want to see people, and I don't think we're in the mood to celebrate right now. Sorry. Then maybe go to the cinema. Like before, remember, we went every Friday, she asked with a trembling voice. But Mark responded evasively to any proposal. Not now, or I'm busy. Emily realized that their relationship was rapidly falling apart, and the more she tried to regain their former intimacy, the colder he became. In the evening, when Mark was sitting in the living room with his laptop, she came up, sat down next to him, and carefully put her hand on his shoulder. He shuddered, as if moving away, and closed the laptop. Mark, Emily said, trying not to cry, I know that everything is bad with us. But we can try to start again. I made a terrible mistake. I don't ask you to immediately forget about it. But I love you, please. Give me a chance. He looked at her with a heavy, tired look. You know, he said, I tried. I restrained myself for a whole month, then another. I hoped that I could forget. But every touch reminds you that you were with someone else, and I can't seem to live with it. The words hit her like hail, and Emily squeezed her eyes shut, feeling the tears well up in her throat. But you said that you wouldn't leave, that you would try to fix everything, she reminded him almost in a whisper. I myself believed that I could survive this, he sighed. But I understand that no. I no longer feel like we are one family. It pains me to say this, but I don't want to deceive either you or myself. He spoke rather coldly, although everything inside him was trembling with tension. Partly he felt sorry for his wife, who really did not try to shift the blame onto him, and was looking for a reason to make up for her mistake. But time passed, and trust was not restored. In addition, the desire to be with Sarah rose more and more clearly in his soul, and he considered it unacceptable to lie, pretending to be a loyal husband, but in fact love another. Emily, unable to contain her emotions, burst into tears. Mark wanted to put his hand on her shoulder, but something inside resisted. "I can't," he whispered in his thoughts. "This is no longer right." The next day, when Emily returned from work, Mark was already waiting for her at home. His appearance did not bode well. He was sitting on the sofa, his keys and some kind of envelope were on the coffee table. "We need to talk," he said, not letting her take off her coat. Emily went cold. "What's happened?" "I thought for a long time about what we should do," he began, "and I came to the conclusion that we are pulling each other into the abyss. Let's not deceive each other, our feelings are dying, or maybe they're already dead." She nodded confusedly, as if admitting the obvious. "Emily, you know why I can't forgive you," Mark continued. "I tried, but if you had cheated and it somehow brought us closer, then everything would have been different. But it turned out that we were just trying to cling to the wreckage. I don't want to live in such an atmosphere." "Mark, I understand." She fell silent, unable to find words. "I don't see any point in holding on to this marriage anymore," he exhaled and felt a strange emptiness vibrate inside him. "I'm filing for divorce." Emily clenched her hands in horror. Tears of their own accord rolled down her cheeks. "No, please don't do this. I'm ready to change everything. I can quit, we'll move to another city, start from scratch. I'll do anything, as long as you're by my side." She spoke quickly, haltingly, hoping that drastic measures would help him change his mind, that it was enough to switch to a new environment and he would forgive her. But Mark just sadly shook his head. "It's not about the city or the place of work," he said. "It's in our hearts, and in trust that no longer exists. I don't want to scream or cry again. I'm just tired." Emily fell to her knees in front of the sofa, grabbing his hands. "Please give me more time. I'm sure we can get out of this. I love you." "But I don't love you anymore," Mark whispered, and he himself shuddered from these words. He felt like he was hurting her more than anyone had ever hurt her. But he couldn't say anything else. The image of Sarah flashed in my head with her soft smile, kindness, lack of reproaches. It was to Sarah that his soul was now drawn, although he never said out loud that he wanted to be with her. He understood. Before building something new, you need to close the old door, and the relationship with Emily cannot be returned. Emily covered her face with her hands in tears. Mark felt a prick of conscience, but knew that he could no longer live in self-deception. He stood up, helped her up, and then said, "I'm officially filing for divorce. For starters, maybe one of us should move. I'm looking for an option to rent an apartment for a while." "No," Emily whispered hoarsely, "don't go. It will be better that way. I'm not going to kick you out. The apartment is shared, but I will live separately. I think you yourself understand that the two of us have nothing to do here," he said, trying to stay calm, but inside he was shaking from nervous tension. She tried to object, but could no longer find the strength. She realized with bitterness that with her own hands she had destroyed what they had been building for 7 years, and it seems that no amount of persuasion or tears will help. Mark went to the closet, pulled out a travel bag, and began silently collecting the essentials. Emily sat in the living room, holding her head in her hands. Despair and pain filled her, but she could not say anything that would change his decision. Half an hour later, he came out of the bedroom, holding a bag in his hands. He stopped at the threshold and looked at her. Their gazes met. There were tears in Emily's eyes and heavy sadness in Mark's. "I didn't want it to end like this," he said. "Forgive me for not being able to forgive." "No, it's my fault." She tried to object, but he just shook his head. "Don't look for the guilty. We have both reached a point where we can no longer return to the same feelings. One way or another, I will take care of you, help you financially if necessary. But as a man and a woman, we can no longer be together." "I love you," Emily said, swallowing back tears. "And I am grateful to you for 7 years," was all he answered. He walked out the door, quietly closing it. The next few days passed in tension for Mark. He rented a small one-room apartment on the other side of the city. Fortunately, his finances allowed. I spent my days in the office, trying to immerse myself in work as much as possible, but thoughts of a breakup constantly popped up in my head. Colleagues did not know anything, and he did not share news about his personal life, preferring to remain silent. And Sarah, when they met in the corridor, at first she smiled at him embarrassedly, seeing that he was exhausted and gloomy. She didn't understand what had happened, but she guessed something serious. A week after he left home, Sarah saw Mark in the office cafeteria and quietly asked, "You look very depressed. Sorry if it's none of my business, but is everything okay?" He hesitated, sighed, and, smoothing his hair, answered, "No, not all. I filed for divorce. I left home." Sarah's face reflected a whole range of emotions: surprise, pity, some kind of quiet sympathy. She said quietly, "Sorry, I didn't know. And I don't think it's because of me." "No, not because of you," he replied. "A gap has formed between me and Emily after her. Action. I tried to save my family, but I couldn't." "I understand," she nodded. "You must be in a lot of pain right now." "Yes," he said honestly, "but there is also relief in me. I'm tired of living a lie, pretending that everything will be fine." Sarah reached out to his hand, but stopped in time, afraid to touch the wounds. However, her eyes showed a readiness to support, and Mark felt that he wanted more, not just moral support. But at the same time, I remembered how I once reproached Emily for having an affair. "I'll do everything honestly," he thought. "First, I'll officially divorce, only then will I allow myself a new relationship, so as not to be like Emily." It was late evening when most of the employees had left and only a few people remained in the office. Mark, having completed his urgent tasks, walked along the empty corridor to the elevator. I accidentally saw that the light at the reception was still on. He looked in and noticed Sarah removing papers from her work area. "Isn't it time for you to go home?" he asked quietly. "I'll finish now and leave." Sarah turned around, putting a stack of documents aside. "Why are you still here?" "I don't want to go to an empty apartment. It's so quiet there," he admitted. "For the first time in 7 years, I live alone, and it's strange." Sarah, blushing, as if she had gathered her courage, looked into his eyes. "If I can help with anything, listen." He came closer. I saw excitement and unusual tenderness in her gaze. The feeling in his chest came to life with renewed vigor, the same one that he had recently stubbornly suppressed. Previously, he convinced himself that he had no right to new feelings, because formally he remained married. Now, having pronounced the decision on divorce, he felt how the viscous shackles were falling off. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I don't want to repeat Emily's mistakes. I feel like I'm falling in love with you, but I don't want to do it secretly, behind my back. I filed for divorce. I want to end everything honestly." She opened her eyes wide. "Mark, I also can't deny that I'm drawn to you, but it's all very confusing. I was afraid that I would become the destroyer of your family." "The family is already destroyed," he objected bitterly, "and not with your hands. This happened long before you, because of Emily's actions and my inability to forgive." Sarah closed her eyes and exhaled. "I just didn't want to hurt you anymore." Mark involuntarily smiled through his bitter mixed feelings. "You managed, on the contrary, to give me a ray of hope." For several seconds they simply looked at each other without moving. It seemed that in these moments there was a silent recognition. Both understood that they were attracted to each other, but they were afraid of moving too hastily. After all, Mark was still a legal husband, and his divorce, although settled, was not a completed matter. "I understand that it takes time," Sarah said, finally breaking the silence. "And I won't rush you. But if you just want to talk or meet outside the office for a walk, I'm ready." He nodded, relieved that she wasn't demanding instant love. Now the most important thing for him was not to repeat history, in which he himself was a victim of lies. And yet, tenderness and a strong attraction to Sarah were already seething in him, promising a new page in life. Mark, as usual, was in no hurry to go home that night. He understood that he could no longer return to Emily. Her tears and pleas could not melt his heart, burned by betrayal, and Sarah embodied the warmth and sincerity that he had been missing all last month. Mark didn't want to be a bad person. He didn't want to repeat the path his wife took a secret affair on the side. That's why I decided on the final decision: file for divorce, leave, and then start all over again. In the coming days, they had to settle formalities, discuss the division of property, banking issues. Emily agreed, albeit with tears in her eyes, because she understood that it was useless to fight further. Mark internally felt regret, because after all, they had happy years. They went through a lot hand in hand. But he could not overcome the anger and disgust at what she had done, and also could not deny that his heart had long been with someone else. From now on, the future was uncertain for him, but at the same time he felt a strange lightness. It was as if, by admitting that he was unable to forgive and wanting to complete this stage, he had finally freed himself from the constant internal struggle. And even though there was a lot of trouble ahead, deep down Mark already knew. Now his life would take a different path. Will he be able to find true happiness with Sarah? Time will show. In the meantime, he made the main decision: to remain honest, not to play a double game, but to directly tell Emily that it was all over, that he had not forgiven, had not forgotten, and would not be able to live as before. And of course, he did not want to become the same traitor that he saw her in his eyes. These thoughts, although sad, gave him a powerful impetus for change. This means that the marriage, which seemed ideal a year ago, has now come to an end. And looking into the future, Mark hoped for only one thing: not to repeat the mistakes of others and not to lose the sincerity of feelings that began to arise in his heart with the appearance of Sarah. Mark woke up in a cold sweat. For the third day in a row, he could not contact Sarah. The phone number she provided at the office remained disconnected. All attempts to write messages to her ended in nothing. They were not delivered, and Sarah's page on the social network seemed to freeze. At first, Mark thought that she was sick or took a short vacation, but for several days no one at work knew where she had disappeared to. The anxiety in Mark's soul was growing. He lay awake at night, replaying in his head everything that could happen. After all, just recently he finally decided to divorce Emily and was seriously thinking about his future with Sarah. She became a source of warmth and understanding for him after all the drama, and suddenly she disappeared without warning. Maybe she decided to avoid me. He tried to find a logical explanation. But this did not fit into the picture. They had no conflicts. On the contrary, the last time they talked cautiously about being together as soon as Mark settled the divorce issues. When there was no news for several days, he realized that the matter was serious. He began calling their few mutual acquaintances, asking if Sarah had left somewhere suddenly, but no one had the information. On the fourth day, Mark came to the local police station and reported the loss. "I'm afraid for the safety of my friend," he told the officer at the counter. "She disappeared. The phone is not available. This doesn't look like her at all." However, the policeman only threw up his hands sympathetically and explained that without obvious signs of a crime and without a statement from his closest relatives, they cannot put a person on the wanted list. "Perhaps she just changed her number or went on vacation," the officer suggested. "If you find anything specific, please contact me." Mark walked out of there, gripping the steering wheel of his car so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Snatches of phrases that Sarah sometimes uttered when she talked about leaving the past city surfaced in her memory. "I ran to hide." Then she did not go into details, and he did not insist. Now it seemed to him that this was the answer. Perhaps someone from her past had found Sarah again. Another week passed, and Mark could no longer sit idly by. No one at work knew where Sarah was. She stopped communicating and didn't withdraw a penny from her bank account. He decided to act on his own. First of all, I went to the house where Sarah was renting. I found the address I needed and went up to the floor, but the door was locked and obviously empty. Neighbors said that the tenant suddenly packed her things and moved out at night, No one saw exactly the moment of her departure. The landlady whom Mark contacted was annoyed. She left behind the rent, didn't warn me, just left. I don't know where to look for her now. Returning to the car, Mark felt everything inside getting colder. Sarah disappeared without a trace, and what frightened him most was the thought that she was forced to leave. Out of the corner of his ear, he remembered how she said that there was a certain former partner in her past from whom she fled. Mark didn't know the details, but he guessed this could be an extremely dangerous person. He continued asking questions and soon came across an acquaintance of Sarah's named Linda, who had once worked with her at the previous bar. Linda agreed to meet at a cafe on the other side of town. She seemed worried when she heard that Sarah was missing. Sarah was stalked by her ex. His name is Curtis, Linda said in a quiet voice, wary of prying ears. He revolved around crime, periodically did something with stolen cars, and threatened Sarah with physical harm. She ran away from him to another city and changed her number. Mark clenched his fists under the table. Damn, so he could have overtaken her. Do you know where he might be? I only know that he had some kind of semi-legal car service on the outskirts. There, he and his friends repaired cars Linda said repaired with obvious mockery. Most likely, they switched numbers and made fakes. Sarah was afraid that sooner or later Curtis would find her, and so it seems that this is what happened. This was enough for Mark to make a plan, albeit an extremely risky one. The police did not help. He could only find out for himself where Sarah was being kept. By the evening of the next day, he found that same abandoned industrial zone. Rusty warehouses, boarded-up buildings, sparse truck stops. Among them was a small old hangar, on the doors of which one could see the auto repair sign already half peeling off. Mark parked far away so as not to attract attention and walked. Two strong men stood at the gate of the building. When they saw Mark, they became wary. He didn't look like one of their own. "What do you want, buddy?" one muttered. "I'm looking for Curtis," Mark answered, more firmly than he actually felt. "Why on earth?" The second one narrowed his eyes. "I need to talk. This concerns Sarah," Mark said briefly, realizing that whether he was lying or not was useless. Forceful methods decide everything here. They looked at each other. One chuckled ironically. "Sarah, so it looks like Curtis really found her." "Where is she?" Mark couldn't stand it. "I don't think that's your concern," the first one replied, crossing his arms over his chest. "Get out while you're still alive." But Mark did not move. His heart was pounding, but he knew there was no turning back. "I need to make sure she's okay." The guard grimaced. "Okay, come in if you feel like it. But don't be offended if you leave there without teeth." He opened the gate. Mark entered the room, filled with the pungent smell of machine oil and solvent. In the depths stood two cars with their wheels removed, and tools and spare parts were lying around. Above all this, there was a dim light from the ceiling lamps. In the center of the hangar, as if he owned the place, stood a short, stocky man in a leather jacket, and with a clanking set of keys on his belt. Next to him, there were two more. One was holding a metal pipe in his hands, the other, having nothing better to do, was twisting a screwdriver in his fingers. One glance was enough for Mark to understand that it was Curtis and his friends. "And who came to us?" Curtis muttered, looking at Mark. "Who are you?" "Mark," he answered. "I'm looking for Sarah." Curtis laughed an evil laugh. "And that means her boyfriend. Where does he come from so brave? And Sarah, you see, is captured with us. Funny. There's no connection with her." Mark's voice sounded tense. "I believe this is not her voluntary decision." "We'll see about that later," Curtis said brazenly. "Sarah herself knew that there was nowhere to return. She owes me, and so be it, help her deal with her debts. No, she wouldn't disappear like that." Mark couldn't stand it. "I know you bullied her." At the word intimidated, Curtis turned purple. His people, noticing this, stopped standing lazily and began to approach Mark closer, closing a semicircle. "Boy, you're not in the right territory to present something," said one of them, resting his pipe on the floor. "You think we don't know that you came for Sarah," added another. But if Curtis said that she does everything voluntarily, then that's true. Mark cringed internally. There were three of them, plus two at the exit. He understood that he had started an extremely dangerous game. But at that same second, in a remote corner of the hangar, he noticed a door, and it seemed to him that there was someone behind it. Perhaps Sarah. Where is she now? Mark repeated the question, raising his voice. Are you tired of living? One of the thugs muttered. Curtis, maybe we can get him out of here. Wait, Curtis grinned, twirling the wrench in his hands. I want to listen to what our hero has to say. I'm ready to negotiate, Mark decided. If the problem is money, I can find the amount you tell me. Just let Sarah go. Curtis burst out laughing. Well, you are an optimist. Amount, you say. Do you even know how much the world owes me for all the grievances? He moved closer. His face was opposite Mark. Rough features, a scar under his left eye. I'm afraid no one will be able to pay all my claims. One of the accomplices snorted. Mark realized that there might not be a peaceful solution. But he said again, almost desperately, let me at least see Sarah. Let her say what she wants. At these words, Curtis glanced towards that door. And then something happened that no one expected. The door swung open, and Sarah herself appeared on the threshold. She looked pale, disheveled, and had horror in her eyes. Seeing Mark, she gasped. Mark, what are you doing here? Leave. She stopped short, and immediately one of the thugs rushed to grab her shoulder. Let go, Sarah shouted, trying to break free. Hey, stop. Curtis raised his hand to stop him. She won't go anywhere. Sarah, are you with me? Mark croaked, meeting her gaze. I've been looking for you for a week now, I thought that. She looked at him with despair and hope at the same time. But Curtis stepped between them. Listen, buddy, you got it all wrong. Sarah, my girlfriend, came back on her own and begged me to forgive her. Isn't that right, beauty? He turned to Sarah, smiling an evil grin. No, she whispered, shuddering with fear. I never wanted to go back. Curtis's accomplices, as if on command, moved towards Mark. He tried to jump away, but one of them easily punched him in the jaw, the other swung a pipe. Mark, staggering from the blow, felt blood flowing from his lip. He grabbed a nearby wrench from a workbench, but only managed to lightly whack his attacker's arm before being restrained. Mark. Sarah screamed and started to move towards him, but Curtis held her by the wrist, not allowing her to get closer. Look what I'll do to him, one of the thugs said angrily, twisting Mark's arms. He tried to break free, but it was impossible to hold the three. Maybe we can let you go. Curtis took pity, baring his teeth in fake mercy. Or let him watch as I take Sarah and throw him out like a dog. Mark, clutching the floor with his feet, found a moment and turned sharply, striking one of the bandits with his elbow. He groaned and let go of his hand. With considerable strength, Mark threw the second one to the floor. But the third instantly rushed forward and hit Mark on the shoulder with the pipe. The pain was sharp. Mark staggered and fell to his knee, trying not to let go of the improvised weapon from his hand. Enough. Curtis raised his voice, seeing that the showdown was threatening them with interference. He didn't want any noise. Police patrols sometimes drove into the outskirts. Drag him to the exit and calm him down. No, Sarah begged, suddenly rushed and tripped the thug who was standing closest. He collapsed, dropping the pipe. Mark, seeing his chance, pushed the second bandit with all his might, causing him to fall onto a box of parts, and Mark himself grabbed Sarah by the arm. Run, he shouted, trying to protect her. But there were two more standing at the door. They blocked the exit. Mark realized that they were trapped. The fight resumed. The bandits began to attack Mark, who, however, reflected the blows with unexpected passion, because now he understood that everything was being decided right now. Suddenly, there were screams and dogs barking outside. As it turned out, the noise from the fight was heard by the patrolman. The lights of the police flashing lights penetrated through the cracks of the gate, and the voices of the officers demanded, "Stop, hands up." The bandits froze. Curtis, gritting his teeth, realized that it was time to run away if he didn't want to meet with the cops. He angrily pushed Sarah away, took off, and ran to the back exit. His two accomplices are behind him. Mark, staggering from pain, picked up Sarah. "Are you a body?" She nodded, although her whole body was trembling. I couldn't speak because of the shock. Another second, and several policemen burst into the room with weapons at the ready. They saw Mark, bloodied, with Sarah in scraps of clothing, and realized that not everything was clean here. "Hands! Show your hands!" The officer shouted, however, noticing that they had no weapons. He asked, "What is happening here?" "They're holding us," Mark said hoarsely, pointing to the place where the thugs disappeared. "They mastered here. They escaped through that door." Some of the police gave chase. The rest stayed on the spot to help Mark and Sarah. As a result, they were taken to the police station, where both testified. They said that Curtis had kidnapped Sarah, threatening to kill her, and Mark had gotten in to save her. Later, Mark and Sarah, after going through a medical examination, returned to Mark's rented apartment. The officers explained that they had not yet been able to arrest Curtis. He had fled, but the police now had reason to look for him and his entire gang. Sarah sat on the sofa, legs crossed and clutching a mug of tea. Her eyes were filled with tears of relief. Mark sat down next to her, trying not to wince from the pain in his shoulder, and covered her hand with his. "Forgive me that I didn't realize earlier what danger you were in. I wouldn't let him get close to you." "It's not your fault," she whispered. "I was thinking, it's better to leave on my own than to drag you in. Curtis threatened to kill anyone who came close to me. He said there was no hiding from me. So I turned off the phone and ran away from the apartment. But he still found me first. The main thing is that you're here now, nearby," Mark said, "and together we will think about how to protect you from him. Now that the police are aware, he is less likely to act openly." Sarah trembled, blinking away tears from time to time. "Thank you for not giving up, looking for me. Maybe it sounds stupid, but I never thought that someone would care so much about me." "You are dear to me," Mark answered, carefully pressing her to him. "I only recently realized how much. When I realized that I had lost you, it was scary." They froze in their embrace, realizing that there was a difficult path ahead. Curtis, most likely, would not stop. But now Sarah is not alone, and Mark promised himself that he would not let her disappear alone again. Below is the final part of the story, Broken Trust, in which, some time after dangerous events, Sarah and Mark build a life together, free from old resentments and fears. Emily reappears in their lives, trying to bring back the past, but Mark realizes that he is no longer the same person he used to be. The text is in Russian, up to about 2,000 words. A lot of time has passed since Mark managed to save Sarah from the hands of her ex, a dangerous man named Curtis. A lot has changed since then. Mark finally achieved an official divorce. At first, he felt a slight bitterness that 7 years of marriage with Emily had disappeared like a mirage, but he saw that they had no longer had strong feelings for a long time. Emily's betrayal destroyed their trust, and time only confirmed that it was better for both of them to go their separate ways. At first, Sarah lived with Mark almost like a guest. She was afraid that Curtis would return. From time to time, she was summoned to the police to give new testimony in the case. Mark helped her hire a lawyer to, if necessary, stop any attempts on Curtis's part to get close again. And although at times they were both scared, a feeling of mutual support settled more and more firmly within Sarah and Mark. They went through the ordeal together, and now every day they learned how to build a relationship without lies and pain. During this time, Mark gradually improved his life. He moved things from his previous apartment, divided property with Emily, helped her pay off the necessary debts, if any, but he did this more out of a sense of responsibility rather than love. They barely communicated. The last time they signed papers in the presence of lawyers, Emily looked depressed, but she no longer tried to stop him. However, late one evening, while Mark was watching movies in the living room with Sarah, his phone rang. He looked at the screen. Unknown number. At first, I decided not to answer, but the anxiety inside prompted me to pick up the phone. A painfully familiar voice was heard. "Hello, Mark. This is Emily." He went into the kitchen so that Sarah would not hear every sound and asked quietly, "Why are you calling?" "I need to talk. It's urgent. Everything related to our divorce proceedings is completed," he said in an even tone. "What else is there to talk about? Please, Mark, give me at least 10 minutes." Mark, after hesitating, nevertheless agreed to meet. He felt that in his soul he no longer had the same emotions, neither anger nor insane melancholy. He wasn't afraid to talk to her, he just didn't see the point. And yet, memories of 7 years of marriage told him, give her a chance to say what she wants. The next day, they agreed to meet in a small cafe not far from the office district where they previously worked. Mark arrived on time and sat down at a table by the window. Emily soon came in, clutching her bag with both hands. She looked confused and more modest than usual. She was wearing a simple dress. Her hair was pulled back into a messy bun. Mark only noted that over this year, she seemed to have matured and become more haggard. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly, sitting down opposite him. "Talk," he answered briefly. Emily lowered her eyes. I, I just wanted." She sighed, plucking up her courage. "I know I made a terrible mistake. I cheated on you and ruined everything. But I have feelings. I miss. I understand that it's probably late, but I can't get everything we built out of my head." Mark listened to her without interrupting, trying to understand himself. Previously, the words about love spoken by Emily would have excited him. Either anger or hope would have flared up in him that everything could be returned. But now he felt only calm. "Emily," he said finally, "I don't want to be rude, but it's really over. We are not the same people we were 7 years ago. I didn't regret getting divorced. I'm not going to start all over again." Emily's eyes moistened. "Don't you really want to go back to the past?" He shook his head. "No, I have found a new life, and frankly, I'm happy. Your betrayal then showed that our ideal marriage was just a shell. Sorry, but I'm not trying to sound arrogant. I just don't feel the way I once did for you anymore." Emily was silent for a few seconds, and then said quietly, "Understand. You know, I'm so sorry that I didn't take care of what we had. Now I understand that we have lost each other. Do you already have someone?" "Yes," Mark answered firmly, without going into details. "And I don't want to deceive. Feelings for Sarah are already a reality that I am not going to deny." Emily nodded, looking away. Perhaps she was expecting a surge of emotion, or, on the contrary, a furious reproach. But Mark spoke calmly, and this made it harder for her. She could only bitterly realize that the bridges had been burned, and he was moving on. They sipped coffee for a couple of minutes, exchanging meaningless phrases about business. Finally, Emily stood up herself, realizing that the conversation had reached a dead end. "Good luck to you," she said, forcing out a weak smile. "And you," Mark answered briefly. Sarah happily welcomed Mark home, noticing from his face that the meeting had gone smoothly. She didn't ask for details. She knew the conversation with his ex-wife would probably mean something to him. But Mark himself briefly said, "She wanted to bring us back," he said, taking off his coat. "But I'm not the same anymore. And you know, it doesn't hurt me. I just feel like I'm moving on." Sarah hugged him, pressing her cheek to his chest. "I'm glad you found peace. I understand what happened, and I don't want to pry into your past. The main thing is that we are together." Thus began their common new stage. Sarah, having recovered from the stress and threats of Curtis, found a job in a specialty that she had always liked. She became an assistant manager in a small travel company. Mark developed his own architectural business. Periodically, the police still involved them in the case against Curtis looking for evidence, but rumors that the gang had finally been caught appeared only in fits and starts. One way or another, Sarah no longer lived in constant fear. She changed phone numbers and addresses, but now she had a defender, Mark, and the law enforcement agencies themselves were more attentive to her case. In everyday life, their worries were surprisingly simple and pleasant. Dinners together, going to the cinema, rare trips out of town. It was a life in which every day was not poisoned by suspicion or jealousy. Mark still sometimes felt a pang when he remembered Emily, not because he was bored, but rather because he realized how easily a relationship could fail without trust and honesty. A year has passed. The gray, cold months gave way to spring, then summer, and again in autumn the air became fresh and cool. Mark had already forgotten about Emily's recent call. His life was flowing in a new, more harmonious direction. Sarah, as life showed, was a kindred spirit to him. He appreciated her calmness, sincerity, the way she avoided even small lies, because she herself experienced betrayal and suffered from violence. Now they knew how to speak directly, without hushing up grievances. One Saturday evening, Mark arranged a little surprise for Sarah. He booked a table at a cozy restaurant on the lake shore, where they had long wanted to go. She, of course, guessed that Mark wanted to do something special, although she did not understand what exactly. He brought her to the lake at sunset. The water, reflecting orange reflections, glistened under the light ripples of the wind. They took a table by the panoramic window and ordered drinks. Sarah looked at Mark with tenderness, trying to guess what was going on in his soul. When it was time for dessert, he pushed the plate away and suddenly took out a small box from his inside pocket. Sarah caught her breath. This could not be confused with anything. Mark said quietly but clearly, "Sarah, from the very minute I found you when you disappeared until today, I realized that I couldn't live without you. I thought that after all the betrayal in the past, I would never risk tying myself with official ties, but—" He looked up at Sarah. She sat without taking her eyes off, her palms trembling slightly with excitement. "But I'm not the same person I was before," Mark continued. "I'm ready for a new life in which we build a family together without lies, without omissions and fear. Do you agree to become my wife?" For a couple of moments, the world seemed to freeze, and then tears appeared in Sarah's eyes. However, these were tears of happiness, not grief. She nodded with a smile, trying not to cry. "Yes, of course, yes. I want this with all my heart." Mark opened the box and took out a simple but very elegant ring. He took her hand and put the ring on her finger. Everything around seemed to light up. The sunset was blazing in the windows of the restaurant, reflected in the surface of the lake. A couple of customers at nearby tables guessed what had happened and began to applaud. Sarah laughed and cried at the same time, and Mark felt a slight tremor of delight inside, realizing that at that moment he had chosen a new destiny. After dinner, they went ashore to breathe in the cool air and watch the sun set below the horizon. Sarah pressed herself close to him. "You know, if they told me a year ago that I would be standing here with a ring on my finger after everything that happened to me, I wouldn't have believed it. But you changed my life, Mark." "And you changed mine," he answered tenderly. "I was once sure that after Emily's betrayal, I would hardly be able to open up to anyone again. But life has shown that we can learn to trust again if we want." She squeezed his hand, watching the sun sink into the water. Episodes of their difficult history popped up in my head. The pain and disappointment of the divorce, threats from Curtis, fear of loss. All these trials seemed to cement their relationship, making it stronger and more sincere. "Now we will have our own story," Sarah said quietly. "I don't want any secrets, no secrets. Let everything be straight and honest." "I agree," Mark smiled. "Honesty is the only thing on which we can build a truly strong family." They were silent, listening to the water rustling near the shore and the cool breeze ruffling the ends of their hair. In this silence, there was no shadow of old grievances. There was still a lot of work ahead. To formalize the marriage, perhaps move to a more spacious house, talk with lawyers regarding the Curtis case. But all this did not seem scary, because now they were together and ready to support each other. Mark remembered how Emily recently begged him to bring back the past. And, standing next to Sarah now, he was finally convinced that the past really could not be returned and was not necessary. He had a new life ahead of him, full of love and trust. He no longer regretted the divorce. That old marriage had completed its role in his destiny. It's time to move on. "Your hands are cool," he remarked, and Sarah laughed, covering herself with a scarf, and Mark carefully hugged her to warm her up. "Nothing, everything is fine," she answered. "I always feel warm next to you." These simple words resonated in his heart with a tenderness that he had not felt for many years. It was as if right at that moment he had finally found that very safe haven that he had once dreamed of, but he just didn't know where to find it. The next morning they woke up in their cozy apartment, the sun's rays streaming through the loosely closed curtains. Sarah, still not accustomed to the ring on her hand, looked at it as if it were something almost unreal. Mark, clinging to her, smiled, realizing that every morning from now on could be so calm and joyful without torment, without remorse. Soon, they may celebrate their engagement with friends, and perhaps they will arrange a small wedding ceremony not too magnificent, but very personal, symbolizing for both of them the beginning of life without lies and pain, as the two of them like to repeat. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even click to the next one.